great to be stuck in a bookstore all day long, and you're all welcome to come and do that. Well, it's amazing to have Amy Irvine and Regina Lopez Whiteskunk here tonight. Amy and Regina worked quite a lot in the formation of the recently diminished Bears Ear Monument, and I believe they're going to discuss that a bit tonight. Amy's first book that she wrote, Trespass, Living at the Edge of the Promised Land, won a number of awards, including the Colorado Book Award. And she's going to be spending most time on this book tonight, Desert Cabal, which I think the publishers, Back of Beyond Books in Moab and Torrey House Press, asked Amy to write an introduction to their publication of Desert Solitaire, Ed Abbey's classic book that has had its 50th anniversary this year. And so Amy went down and communed with Ed at his final resting place in the Sonoran Desert and had a conversation with him. And she wrote too much for the introduction, so they made a book of it, and it's a wonderful book. And we have a bunch of copies of it over there on the counter. And I'm going to just turn it over to Regina and Amy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Good luck with the microphone.
We'll figure it out. We might just hand it back and forth, I think.
I'm going to leave it up to you.
So we can pull it off of there. Should we do it this way, I think? Okay. Is that okay? Can you hear us? Wow, what a turnout for a tiny town. Thank you. I mean, I guess not so tiny anymore, but what an honor to be here and know that everybody's here because they care about places that Regina and I have been very devoted to for a long time, and of course, even more so recently. She's a beloved sister in arms. I'm really honored to have her along for this wild ride. Regina wrote the afterword for Desert Cabal, and I think we'll start with telling you a little bit about the process, because have any of you ever seen The Making of Apocalypse Now, the documentary about the book? It's as interesting as Apocalypse Now is, and I think it's that way with this particular book, because it wasn't supposed to be a book, as Danny just inferred. So yes, this is the 50th anniversary of Desert Solitaire. Who here loves Desert Solitaire? Yeah, I was afraid of that. I love it too, but reading it with fresh eyes after Trump and Kavanaugh and Me Too and pussy grabs and land grabs, the monuments being stripped, suddenly it felt really urgent, and I couldn't believe the timing. This book was totally accidental and turned out to be absolutely intentional. So most of you know Back of Beyond Books over in Moab. Andy Nettle, the wonderful proprietor over there, he got through the University of Arizona archives with their permission and Clark Abbey, Ed's widow, her permission. He got the original manuscript of Desert Solitaire, and he made a limited edition of facsimiles and the original manuscript has all of Abbey's editing on it in his own handwriting, and they made a limited editions of those in these beautiful linen boxes, and it was embossed with Abbey's own hieroglyph. And they asked me to write an introductory essay just reflecting on Desert Solitaire 50 years hence. And I said yes before they'd even finished the sentence, and I didn't even know why I was saying yes. It just felt suddenly like, oh my gosh, if I could speak to somebody who's shaped my lens on the world so much, that would be a really exciting opportunity. But the first thing I said, or the next thing I said was, who more famous turned you down so that I'm, the B team? And Andy said, no, you are the only person we want to do this. And I said, okay, so why? And he said, because it mattered to me why he was choosing me, because I had a sense of what I would be doing, and I want to make sure we're on the same page. And he said, well, we really feel it has to be a female voice, and we really feel that it should be somebody from Utah, and that has a long-standing family history here and who has also been a bit of a rebel rouser, a wilderness advocate, park ranger. Edward Abbey and I have traveled parallel lives in a number of ways. And I said, okay, so I will be a rebel rouser in writing this essay. And he said, yeah, that's the plan, Amy. So I signed a contract for 3,000 to 4,000 words. And this was end of March, early April of this year. And I moved into our new place in Norwood, and I sat down to write, and I fell into another world, and I came up 10 days later, and I had 19,000 words. And I sent it off to Andy, and there was radio silence for a while, and then I kept saying to my partner, I just keep seeing this as it has to have its own spine. It has to stand on its own. I keep having the feeling that writing about Abby in third person, I feel a little bit like Vanna White, from Wheel of Fortune, who turns things around and showcases them, which I didn't mean that in some sort of trite way, like I wanted to have more limelight. It was just that it felt like at this point in time in the nation's history, in this important moment, that I have my own voice and I speak directly to somebody rather than about them. It just felt it, and I didn't know what that was going to look like. So I realized that, like with all my writing, I need a physical landscape to be in to actually have the conversation. So for the record, the disclaimer is I never went to Abby's grave. And there is a little introduction to say that, but I never cared about where he was buried. I have very good friends who were there who know where he's buried and would probably tell me if I tried hard enough to ask, but that's not the point of this. The point was to speak about where we're at now and to wonder where maybe Abby got some of it wrong and where he got it absolutely right, and just sort of examine that with him. And so I had this vision of squatting on good ground and having a conversation. In fact, in my mind's eye, dragged his Coors Light, which was what he liked to drink. Ken Sanders gave me all the little details like this about what Ed liked. I brought my own whiskey because that's what I wanted, and it felt important to have what I wanted too. So this conversation started, and there was so much to say. I had no idea how many questions I had, how many concerns I had, and going back and encountering that text now in just the few years of the Trump administration felt like a whole new ballgame. Has anybody reread Desert Solitaire lately in this new landscape? Did it read differently to you? Or was it the same old, some of you feel like it's just, it is lasting for many, many people, no doubt. I was surprised how much I had to say though, and taking him to task is a little strong. I've been accused of this being a rant, and I'm so bothered by that because it's a love letter to me, really, to everything that I hold dear, and of course to Abby as well. And just like any true love, there's a little bit of wrestling and wrangling over what's working and what isn't, and that was done with all of my heart. It wasn't, there was no effort to take pot shots at a dead man here. It doesn't feel that, I never had that intention at all. But there's been some controversy. Two of my mentors, great wilderness writers that knew Abby, were very offended that I would take on this project. And I said, fair enough, you get to have that opinion. But it underscores what I found to be most vital in this odyssey that I just went on. And that was when I first looked through this hand-edited original manuscript of Desert Solitaire. Early on in that manuscript is a line about Abby's wife and family. And there's a big fat red line through it. And I thought, wow, so solitude was a literary device. It was not really, he was never really alone. There were a lot of other women. There was a wife and children. And then, of course, he drank with uranium miners and hung out with park superintendents and cowboyed for local ranchers. But I was so puzzled by that because I have a very hard time separating myself out from landscape, and the people I love are part of that. And Regina and I have talked a lot about how groups of people have always inhabited wild places, and that we were never solitary because you'd freeze or die or get eaten, or we've always been a community living on a landscape. And so that's where I started, was with this reckoning about the notion of solitude, and why he chose that as a literary device. Now, I got in trouble for having my own literary device about being down at the grave and talking to him, and I find that interesting that I wasn't allowed to have that as my literary device, and he got to be solitary. So this is kind of where it started, was like, wow, for example, you got to call it Abby's country, but you're from Pennsylvania, and I'm a 6th generation Utahn, which in my mind means nothing because the native people, it's their homeland, not mine. But I have been there a long time, and I have some roots there. And can you imagine in my memoir about growing up in Utah and my entire 6 generations of family history there, if I'd referred to it as Amy's country? I don't think I could have gotten away with it in print, really. So it wasn't to take him to task as much as to see where we've come in the period of time since that book was published. And it would be so great if he were here today to engage and ask him what would he think about immigration? What would he think about Trump's wall? There's a horrific clip that was played when I was interviewed on Colorado Public Radio the other day. And it was a clip of Abby talking about how the native people and the Mexican immigrants need to practice a lot more birth control, and it should be mandatory. And that was really, I can't put that aside and say, as many people have said to me, but you have to forgive him. He's from another time, and that's just how we talked about women, and that's just how we talked about brown-skinned people or people that weren't from here. And I have to object to that. He was an educated man who came out of World War II, where language destroying groups of people with hate that was the primary lesson that came out of that war. And then he was writing amid the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the Native American Indian was finally in the Don't Pollute ad on TV, which, these things were very palpable. So I can't excuse him for that, but it doesn't mean that I need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. There's a lot to celebrate as well. So that's how this book started. And then I asked Blake Spalding of Hell's Backbone Grill. Have any of you eaten there down at? So Blake has been taken to task lately for her advocacy for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. She's had swastikas painted in the restaurant's bathrooms. There's an enormous piece on their activism for the monument was in the New Yorker last month. Did any of you see that piece? You should read it. It's really amazing. But the backlash from that has been profound. And she joined us in Salt Lake last night, but she's utterly spent by her efforts, and we're sending her a lot of love tonight. But she wrote the foreword about where we've come in terms of establishing the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which I was a part of when I worked for SUA. And then Regina wrote the afterword about where we're headed, because the Bears Ears marks this significant turning point, right? And I'm going to let her talk a little bit about that. But yes, I'm really grateful that she brought this new perspective into this book, so I didn't have to stand alone. There's a lot of solidarity in this between these pages.
Thank you everybody for coming out, and thank the creator for giving us such great moisture, right? I think our creator has showed us who really is the high and mighty in the big picture here, and I say that because. As Amy mentioned, we have much to be thankful for, as well as to celebrate. And one thing is just several weeks ago, we did have a great breakthrough for the Bears Ears National Monument. The state of Utah had asked the courts to move the venue to Utah. And if you all recall, there was a certain hurricane that popped in right about the time they were supposed to render that decision. And it got pushed back a week. And I think that that was a great way for the rest of us to step back and really take a look at who really is the power at that be here. It isn't us. It isn't the president. It isn't any of the Utah leaders who wish they could be. But there is a higher power out there. So the decision got pushed back a week. A week later to find out that the decision would be in our favor, that it would stay in the Washington, D.C. area. So there's much to be thankful. We've got to watch out for those moments and celebrate those moments. Because it seems as though sometimes there's always just this really gloomy outlook. And we can't let those things get us down. And so my part in the book, which Amy has spoke to this wonderful process, and everything fell into place unintentionally, but they called me up, meaning Amy and Kirsten Allen from Torrey House Press, and asked me if I would be willing to write the afterword, and I said, do you have to ask? I'm with this. I'm already in. But reading it and then trying to figure out what is it that I need to contribute to this, we kind of talked out and tried to figure what is it that we want the whole book to portray. And it occurred to me after, I think, like maybe a half hour visiting with each of them, I says, I know what I need to do. I need to talk about the first time and my first encounter with Utah elected leaders. Because that was the first time I had ever been literally disrespected, invited into a venue to provide testimony, and never got out of my introduction. That also showed me how much the value of a female in general is in this greater conversation. Because although we weigh heavy on apologies and forgiveness, when I left that hearing that day, I was followed by an older white lady who tapped me on my shoulder and said, Regina, I want to apologize for what just happened to you, but welcome to Utah. This is how we treat women. That was a very huge defining moment for me, because although I was born and raised in the Four Corners area on the side of Colorado, did that mean that I had any less to contribute or any less family ties or roots in the state of Utah? No, my mother's from Utah. I grew up traveling through Monticello, Moab, into Roosevelt, in Vernal, being out in Salt Lake on the Wasatch Front. I grew up there. My grandma took us to Hogo Zoo every summer. This is home. So I was very appalled by this, but I was even more disrespected in the manner that I'm an elected leader for my people. Not only just my people, but of a sovereign nation. And this is how I can get treated. At that point, that defined what position I was going to speak from. And so from there on, I have spoken in venues such as this. I've been an advocate amongst the different conservation groups, environmental groups, community groups, tribal groups, and in the end, even the recreational groups. I became a voice and a leader for all people, and I didn't ever expect that. But thanks to that one moment, it helped me to see value in who I was at that point, who I was going to become, and even more so, what work is yet to be done. And so I knew what I needed to bring to this book in terms of the afterword. But I do have to say this really quick. So all you people who raised your hand because you all read Edward Abbey, can I see those hands again? That's awesome. Well, I was told not to read his stuff. And it was actually a very close friend of mine who's an archaeologist. He's a Native American. And he says, Regina, don't read any of Edward Abbey's material. And I said, why? He said, it's going to change you. And this is an interesting conversation I've had with Amy and several people, that it's through the lens of Edward Abbey's writings, which helps form a lot of what people do out on the landscape, their curiosity. And when my friend had told me this, he says, we don't want you to change because you speak from a place. We don't want you to stop speaking from your heart. Because we need you as the Native woman that you are to speak in behalf of our Mother Earth. And so kudos to all you who've read it. But I don't think I will.
My introduction to Edward Abbey was the Monkey Wrench Gang when I was flunking out of my senior year in all my honors classes because my boyfriend had dumped me and I started doing drugs and being really naughty and going to punk rock concerts. And Mr. Krinkle, my high school history teacher, gave me a copy of the Monkey Wrench Gang. He actually wore a t-shirt to school that said, "Hey Duke lives," on the day that the principal asked everybody to wear suits and ties because the news was coming for something. He gave me a map of the Escalante and gave me Monkey Wrench Gang and said, I want you to go there this weekend and read this book and don't come back until you've done that or I'll fail you. And anyway, he's mentioned in the acknowledgments and he just bought like 100 books for me. He's so proud of this book. It's like my #1 fan. So I'll just read a little bit of the beginning so you have a sense of why I felt like I really needed to speak to Abby in my own voice and in a real physical setting. I also realized when I looked through the table of contents of Desert Solitaire, when I was trying to figure out how to structure the book, I realized I had my own story that could fall under each of these titles and that maybe that was the way to talk to him. So this book goes chapter by chapter. And the first one, of course, is The First Morning. Hey, Mr. Abbey, can you hear me down there? This yoke of sun has broken on a horizon sawed in two by saguaros, and I've hopscotched my way through crypto and cacti, sidestepped a sidewinder, and given 2 middle fingers to an Air Force jet that buzzed me while my pants were down to pee on the playa. And now I'm squatting graveside in this lower Sonoran desert that is your resting place, a desert that has, thank the horned gods, not succumbed to the Mad Max lunacy of Moab. We should talk about the Red Rock country of Utah. Desert Solitaire was published 50 years ago this year, and as timeless as that book is, things are changing in ways even your prescient, nimble mind could not have imagined. I'm going to sit here a minute, though, and take in the surroundings. This is a desert more soft and yielding than those of southern Utah, one less feverish in color, less torturous in form. It's a bit easier to breathe here, isn't it? This place doesn't excite, not the way canyon country does, the extremes in our nature. And it holds the whole of the borderlands, both sides, denying our tendency towards sharp, stark divisions and dumbed-down dualities. So it's interesting, Mr. Abbey, that you chose here to lie in situ, given your aversion to immigration. And again, maybe you wanted to return to Arches for a perennial season, but the park's tumescent popularity dissuaded. After all, you predicted rightly that the solitude you found there once upon a time was a much diminished resource. If it was going, it's now nearly gone. In Arches, your bones could not possibly turn to dust in silence. And that's why I'm here today, to talk to you about solitude, both the lack of it and the need. You see, it's getting pretty crowded, even in Utah, where public lands once felt infinite. I wonder if we even know anymore what your definition of the word even means, the feeling that it's not loneliness, but loveliness and a quiet exaltation. So I hope you'll come up and sit with me, for we must chew on this notion of what solitude was and now is. I'd suggest a walk, knowing we'd both love to roam under this honeycomb of sky that drips early morning gold onto spindly arms of Ocotillo, through the pale pink translucence of jackrabbit ears. But I'm guessing that's a lot to ask at this point, given your 29-year repose. Why don't we just sit then, dig our heels into the still cool volcanic ball bearings that masquerade as soil? I promise to seek some semblance of restraint, but it won't be easy. The questions, the concerns, they threaten to rush from my body like a river freed from a blown up dam. About Moab, you can probably imagine the jacked up monster trucks, maybe even the razors, those golf carts on steroids, the least sexy form of transportation known to man. But I bet you can't fathom the base jumpers. That's right, people now don shiny, baggy disco suits and leap off the tallest red cliffs like flying squirrels. There are also these beefed up all-terrain bikes that can circle the White Rim in a day if you've got the quads for the job. And those delicious hidden swimming holes in Mill Creek Canyon. Some days the BLM has to close off access because several hundred people are already arriving in them amid a thick screen of sunscreen, Jaeger, and Red Bull. The entire city, plus the surrounding valley behind the rocks and beyond, emits an ever-present belch of engines. They shine lycra and sweat caffeine. As for arches, no matter where you stand in the park, you can hear the steady roar of it all. Everywhere you look, there are these hyped-up, tricked-out, uber-fit, machine-like humans that pump, grind, climb, soar, and scramble through the desert so fast they're just a muscle blur. The land's not the thing, it's the buzz. So this summer I was teaching for Orion magazine. Do any of you read Orion? Beautiful, beautiful magazine. They do an environmental writing workshop every year, and this summer it was in a retreat center in upstate New York, and it was, you know, a very kind of nice wooded, very natural kind of setting, and people were doing nice things like yoga and meditating, and we were sort of the scrappy group there. We didn't really fit in, but at the same time, there was another group of women veterans from the armed forces with PTSD, and they were there for a weekend of healing. And I was walking along this path in the woods one day. Birds are chirping. I come across an African-American woman who is frozen in terror on the path. And I walk up and I say, "Can I help you?" And she grabbed my arm and said, "You got to get me out of here." I said, "Okay, where do you need to go?" "I don't know, just get me out of here." I said, "Well, let's go up the path to the main area and we'll get our bearings and find out where you need to go. But you're safe here." And she dropped my hand and said, "Honey, don't you ever tell a black woman she's safe in the woods." And in that moment, I was like, solitude and wilderness are totally contextual. They are constructs that are actually pretty narrow. And as much as I love and have very much embraced Abby's definition, I think Regina would, if we could get her to read him, she would have a very different definition of solitude and wilderness, and just as this woman did on the path. And as a woman, as a mother of a child that requires constant care, my daughter has 20 to 30 seizures a day. She has really severe epilepsy. My entire concept of solitude is completely shaped by that now. And as the planet gets more crowded and more people are coming here, we're wondering really what does this mean now? And it's great to feel all curmudgeonly and think, oh, back in the day, when I went to Calf Creek or wherever, there was nobody out there. And the argument is, if you build it, they will come. It's the problem with establishing monuments is then everybody comes. The thing about establishing wilderness areas is then everybody wants to go there and it's on the internet. Yes and no. There are just a lot more people and a lot more people needing an escape from a life that is relatively unsustainable. So I think we have to kind of get beyond that and think what would happen to these places if they weren't protected. I still think that that's our best option. And now that we have these broader constituencies, which we need if we're going to save them, it's not just going to be the wilderness community is a really tight little group of very white privileged people. And how do we broaden that constituency so we can really protect whole places? And we've talked a lot about, we're no longer protecting wild places just for our athleticism, our sense of aesthetics, even our spiritual needs. Like, we're now looking at protecting places so we can save the planet. And so the couple of people who have criticized me for writing this book, I think, well, this is an example of the left eating its own once again. Who gives a damn if I get to write about Abby or not? We have a planet to save. And the thing about Trump supporters is they remain firmly gathered around him, no matter what that man says or does, no matter how much it makes them cringe, they keep their eye on this bigger prize. And I would argue that we need to do more of that and stop splitting hairs about these little things, whether Amy wrote about Abby or how she wrote about Abby. Write your own damn letter about Abby is what I said to one friend who was like, who are you to write to Abby? And I said, write your own letter. Abby would love it, actually, I'm certain. Ken Sanders said he was never happier than when he was pissing off both the right and the left. And this book kind of does both too. So, and I like what Regina said when we're talking about how much we need to complicate the narratives and this divide between these two camps that can no longer even have a conversation. And part of it is a false dichotomy. The example we've been talking about is we have rancher friends, and I also have friends that are really opposed to grazing on public lands. And yet most of my liberal friends that recreate on public lands are on a paleo diet. And for my ranching friends, it really troubles them. They're like, you guys are hypocrites. And you're also not very fun. You're so serious about this stuff. And so so people say, well, what should we do? Find a rancher and ask if you can volunteer and then buy your meat directly from them, maybe eat less of it. But if you pay them really what they deserve and what that animal is worth in terms of the effort that went into them raising it, they could probably run half as many animals. So it's kind of like, where are the places that we can actually be in relationship and break down this dichotomy between the right and the left when it comes to wild places and protecting whole ecosystems? Because, as you would say, we are all walking on the same ground, we're all breathing the same air, we're all drinking the same water, right?
So, over the last couple of weeks, I've been prior to the midterm elections, I was out in the San Juan County on the Navajo reservation. And mind you, I'm a Ute. So you see all you out there, I was in a room full of Navajos, and I was the lone Ute. And I think just, even at that, the other day I was in Cortez at the Sunflower Theater and on stage, and so the audience, the lights were turned down, so I couldn't see the audience, but the lights were on the panelists, and I was on the panel. In both instances, I think that sometimes you just need to harness what you really are feeling and have the courage to say what you need to say. And basically in both venues, I told everybody, you need to get over yourselves. Whether you're Republican, Democrat, whatever you may be, this is the same Mother Earth we have that is beneath our feet. There is no question about it. There's no choice. Unless you're planning on paying oodles of dollars to be transplanted off into some space community, which I know I couldn't do that. There is no choice about that. And Mother Earth is not going to see you whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. And those are the things that we just, at the end of the day, we need to talk about being human. Amy asked, what do you think? I said, I like the color purple. She said, why? I said, because it's red and blue put together. But I think the bigger conversation to some of this, and it resonates very traditionally for me, because my father was raised by his grandfather, who was one of our last healers for my people. And a conversation him and I have had over the last several months is how our ceremonies really are kind of gathered around. And that's basically a prayer putting together an individual from head to toe. And as my dad's saying, you can't take the head and put it over there and think that you're going to speak in the best interest and make sure that that head is healthy and can operate if it's over there. And then the stomach's way over there on the other side there. How can you talk about this one being if the parts are in different places. You can't do that. But yet, when we talk about land, when we talk about public land, it's like somebody taking the stomach and putting it over there, and then we've got fracking issues over here, we've got water quality, we've got air quality, but they're all in very distant places. The reality is it's all connected, it's all one sense of being, and we all need that. And my dad reminded me, you cannot create one person and think that you can separate these different parts out and think that that person is going to be healthy. Can we be healthy if you just talk about just the land only? What are we doing to that land? What do we get from that land? How do we survive from that land? I don't know about you all, but I really like, well, this comes from the land. It comes from process that also is intertwined in getting back to the land and coming up from the land. I don't know about you all, but I sure the heck can't live without this in a day. And so, I think that sometimes as, and I'm going to say, I'm going to include myself, sometimes as politicians, we tend to try to separate out discussions just because it's easier and a little more comfortable. But at the end of the day, if there is no discomfort, then there's no work being done. And that's what we really need to face reality. There's a lot of work. We cannot separate one from the other because it's all one system.
Abby was admirable for trying to talk about population because it is an issue in terms of natural resources and how much the land can bear, right? Like, there's no way around that. And his ideas about how to do that make me wince, but it's admirable. And what happened with the environmental communities, the public lands activism community, we all kind of scurried away from those kinds of issues and just isolated public lands protection without really addressing the intersections of social injustices, like how we'd encroached on native rights to those lands, and things like White Mesa Mill south of Blanding, which is pumping uranium tailings into your son's water, drinking water, and his family's, right? And San Juan County, nobody's doing anything about it. We've tried, actually. We've tried really, really hard. And a group of us even got it standing with the NRC, which is really, really hard to do, but we just got shut down. So poverty and racism always intersect with ecological issues, even public lands issues. And I think we need to be more honest about that. And so that's part of why we joined forces, was to sort of create this whole that you're talking about, right? And this might be a good time to read a short piece. Do you remember Havasu, that chapter from Desert Solitaire? This is a short little one. So this is, when I went back and read this, I was like, oh my God, he took Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness, colonialism, and it's alive and well here. And whether or not it was tongue-in-cheek or not, people argue about that. I'm not going to presume to know if that was also a literary device or not. But it's important to just acknowledge, like, I don't think an editor would let him write that way now. I probably wouldn't get published these days. He'd have to do some editing. Now, about your descent into Havasu, it sounds like my idea of a delightful trip, especially the part where you got good and stuck in that slot and braced for a long, painful death. You called it one of the happiest nights of your life. I've had trips like that. One that left me benighted atop Le Guy du Midi in Chamonix, France, and another in Utah's dark canyon wilderness, where getting lost for a night meant waking up to a roar and running for my life as a flash flood came careening around the bend. These experiences are signs of lives well lived. That is, if you belong to our demographic. So I guess we're not much different than Aaron Ralston or Dean Potter. You remember Aaron Ralston had to cut off his arm when he got his arm pinned? Or Dean Potter that flew in his base jumping suit into a wall in Yosemite. Getting to the outer limits of oneself, even if we don't return with all our parts, even if we don't survive, is what puts us in touch with our animal selves, the place in which physical hungers sharpen, but material longings lessen. At last, we are in the moment where every breath, every bead of sweat matters. It's hard to do with holding this. Do we hold the mic? I think I got it. I think I'm good. Thanks. Let us not forget, though, that to move through the natural world in this way is a privilege that belongs to the able-bodied upper classes, those well-educated, well-employed, and mobile enough, those with the means and free time to make the trip. Which leads me to another issue. This time with your Conradian moment in Havasu, where you delighted in, quote, going native, a phrase that sits squarely in the same province as, quote, Abby's country. Now, you're probably rolling your eyes down there thinking I'm flashing some PC badge at you, but it's so much more than that. Our kind can go primal, we can go feral, we can caterwaul and go AWOL, but we hardly know what it means to be native to anything anymore. You likely meant it tongue-in-cheek, but I hiked into Havasu Canyon the year after a Havasupai Indian killed a female tourist, stabbing her 29 times. I'd carried my daughter in, the camping gear came on the backs of god-awful-looking horses and mules, driven by men who never smiled. While the rest of our party was out hiking one day, I took Ruby to the waterfall. Pebbles pinged around us as we waded in the aquamarine pool. Then the stones hit closer, and they were bigger. I looked up to the cliff tops where a young local man in a Denver Broncos shirt scowled plainly at us. Being spotted didn't stop him from throwing more rocks. I scooped up Ruby and hurried back to camp, a camp so large and packed with tents and stoves that could have been a refugee settlement. Except these were mostly white people who had paid top dollar for their gear, as well as the chance to enter the only portion of Grand Canyon National Park to be commanded, if you can call it that, by a Native American government. The rest of the village was in bad shape and its residents cool to us at best. I wasn't surprised, seeing as most Native American nations have been relegated to postage stamps of land and subjected to endless cycles of poverty, disease, abuse, and addiction. It wasn't until we hiked back up to the rim that I learned about the murder the year before and how insult had added to injury. By the time I arrived, tensions were at an all-time high between tourists and residents. Since the murder, investigators have heard from women who'd been assaulted in Havasu Canyon but hadn't reported the attacks. Such cases involve young male tribal members as well as a large white man who called himself an Indian sympathizer. He slept in the bushes and partied with the locals in an attempt to, quote, integrate. On 2 separate occasions, a woman hiking alone was grabbed from behind by a man who tried to pull her off the trail. Luckily, both women got away. One investigator went on record saying that women shouldn't hike alone in Havasu Canyon. It was just too dangerous. So don't be that creepy white dude who's trying to siphon a sense of meaning and belonging off the desert's native people, Mr. Abbey. They've had enough troubles. And for God's sakes, leave the women be. You might get punched, kicked, maced, or worse. We're a little on edge these days. Just a little. Just a little. I read that part in Albuquerque when the tour started back in October, and a while into the conversation, a woman raised her hand, stood up, and said, you know, 15 years ago, I took a semester off of college and hiked and camped all over southern Utah, and it was the most glorious time of my life. And then I was camping one night in the Escalante, and 3 local men came in with rebar and beat me to a pulp. She barely made it out alive and is very scarred and slightly disabled from the experience. It was a really intense moment for the whole audience to be like, wow, this is not the thing that we're used to hearing about when we go out to recreate on public lands. And a guy he rolled his eyes and stomped his foot and said, well, we get scared out there too, you know. And it was such a disconnect, you know, like the kinds of fears that we have to deal with and the ways that we encounter wilderness and public lands. And I write about some of my own close encounters in here. Lions and bears and wolves, I don't mind, but when it's your own species, it makes it really hard to embrace the wilderness the way I was taught to and the way that I want to in my heart. It doesn't mean I don't go, but it means I'm always kind of watching my back. I'm just trying to think about, you already have something to say. I had a question for you, but go ahead.
And I'm gonna shift that view a little bit. But it wasn't until after a lot of the conversation with Bears Ears that I actually had to begin to take precautionary measures, because I had been so comfortable traveling into Utah alone, and a lot of times out into the public lands area, because that's largely where my work was done. And it was important for me to always be able to reconnect to these important places and spaces, because that was what is sacred to me. But I was more fearful of San Juan County Commissioners, Sheriff's Department. I don't think I could roll into town without anybody not knowing who I was at that point in time, or the fact that I had to check my tires every time I left town. So, I think that watching the shift of the conversation, watching how the threats kind of changed up, it's all the same. It's just different players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Now I want to shift it to the hope, right? We've talked a lot about how hopeful we feel. Your Facebook feed, everything just sounds so, who feels like we're doomed? I mean, politically, economically, ecologically, culturally, right? But half the men in power, and I'm not attacking men here, please don't get that. There's actually a part in the book where I talk about, there's a great deal about all the male partners I've had for hunting, climbing, backpacking, river running, and many stories about my adventures with them. But just to acknowledge there are these underrepresented others that we have to take into account what their experience of solitude and wilderness are, right? If we are all going to have a wider, built, stronger constituency to protect these places. And so I think what has been interesting is the backlash of, you don't get to write about Edward Abbey, and I liken that to the ivory tower of academia. I call it the ivory cabin of wilderness. And I think our goal now is to make sure all these stories get told, and a lot of those stories aren't getting told in the news. Like, there are amazing things happen, and all the men that were displaced from their positions of power through the Me Too assault process, more than half those positions have been filled by women. Friends of mine that are gay, lesbian, any other sexual identity, there's such a spectrum now, I hate to even use specific names, but feel like they've never been as seen and heard as they are now. We have 2 Native American county commissioners in San Juan County. That's unthinkable. I never thought that could happen, right? Which is why I'm pretty sure that that Regina can unseat Scott Tipton. Would everybody here? Yeah. Would you guys vote for her? Would you campaign for her? Right. Totally. So, now we want to shift it to we feel so hopeful, like we're in the game and we're being heard. This book wouldn't have been published before Trump. In fact, very little of my writing that was in this same voice and vein was getting turned away by environmental, editors saying, it's a little bit too feminist for the environmental community, or it's too complicated when you bring in the social aspects of this problem. And all of a sudden people are like, oh my God, give us more. Like, now is the time for this voice. So I see my daughter, more than half her class have gone vegetarian, and they've been vegetarian for 4 years. They're only 14 years old. They saw the movie Racing Extinction and understood that the biggest cause of global warming is eating animals. And I'm a real carnivore. It's been really hard for me to give that up. But my daughter and her friends actively chose this and honor it, and it's not a problem for them. They're like, well, of course we will. That's how we survive. And for all my love-hate stuff and everybody saying, oh, the internet and social media is so bad, those kids are so connected in a way we never were. And they're so emboldened by that. I mean, think about when they start voting and they can deal with like school. They're growing up with school shootings and losing polar bears out on little tiny coffee table sized chunks of ice. Like, the kids understand the world in a global way we did not until it was too late. And they understand that they are inheriting this and that they're already like hardwired for this job. My daughter's like, why would I need more than two pairs of shoes, one for winter, one for summer? She goes to school in Telluride. No other kid in Telluride has two pairs of shoes, but they're starting to, because we've done a lot of work up there actually trying to educate a very liberal elite group about their high carbon footprint, and that until they get honest about that, nobody's really going to trust them. And so I do see things shifting, and I feel such great hope. And do you want to add to that? Because I know you have some, we've talked so much about this, and it's so important.
So again, in San Juan County, the county commissioners' majority is now Native American, of which our very pro-monument.
Yeah, it's great.
That took a lot of effort, especially for those of us who weren't residents of San Juan County. And I think those are moments that we all need to knock down those arbitrary lines. Just because we're not residents there, does that mean we don't need to care or we can't help? Because we can, and we did. And I think we showed them that this is important and we can make those great things happen so that we can celebrate. But I think even on a broader front, on a national level, we elected 2 Native American females to Congress. Woo! We came really close to having the first Native American female governor in Idaho as well. And I do hope that she chooses to run again. But we are going to see this surgence of Native American voices come to the table. And maybe I will be one of them.
Yes.
So I think that a lot of times we just need to take those moments and uncomplicate our views, our opinions, and get over ourselves, and really stop to see the simplicities around us that need to be celebrated. Because as a society, we don't celebrate enough.
Right.
We really get ourselves down with all of the divisions and all of those complications, all of which has all been foretold by elders many generations ago. We're complicating things where things used to be simple. And if we just go back to some of those great moments, we really are just human beings who need to coexist. And I don't think we have a choice in whether we want to save this planet. I think it's something we just know we have to do. And that's the place we need to work from.
Will you say what you said last night about Trump getting elected?
Oh, yes.
It's
So,
important.
and I think it's absolutely important. I know there was a time in my life when, oh gosh, I had just horrible thoughts thinking, oh my God, I can't believe we just elected Trump. What's going to happen? And even stepping back a little further, when President Obama designated 1.35 million acres as Bears Ears National Monument, I celebrated for probably 5 seconds. And I was already on the phone calling up Charles Wilkinson and said, and I always called him Grandpa. I said, Grandpa, I know we just accomplished something so great. And we now have a monument, which we still do. It has happened. But what are we going to do to defend it? Moving from that point, already knowing we would need to defend it, and then coming into a new administration with Donald Trump, I mean, there wasn't a moment that I didn't cry. I did cry. Because I watched everything in front of my eyes literally change. watching the video clips of what DC, the environment in DC, was looking like. To see disrespect on the streets, to hear people talk the way they did about the White House. These are all places that I had the honor of feeling like that house did belong to me. I was in and out of that house so many times that it felt like my house. I walked on the streets confidently, alone. I wouldn't do that today. But with all of that being said, our president has awakened a sleeping giant. That spirit is in each and every one of us. We were so complacent, we were so comfortable, we were so relaxed that it wasn't until something so great was on the fringe of being taken away from us, then we realized we needed to do something. We needed to educate ourselves, we needed one another, and we needed to make sure that we were present in the processes. We needed to be a part of the public comment periods, and we needed to speak to our elected leaders. And I say all our elected leaders, even those outside of the state of Colorado. We do have allies in other states. And to be able to reach out to those individuals is well worth our time, our energy, because like I said, we have no choice but to save this world. We have our great-grandchildren to think about.
Do you want to read that last little bit? I can hold it for you if you want. Thursday, I have to put my glasses on. Yeah. At least 3 pair at all time, right?
There's one in the car.
Do you want me to hold this for you?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Or I'll hold this.
Yeah. So my travels led me back home to my reservation, 2 hours from the Bears Ears in Toyac, Colorado. I always honored the words of my grandmother, the late Stella Itu. No matter where you go, always remember to come home. Sleeping Ute Mountain, July 31st, 2018. The smell of sage and blessings of the rain out on the land. Brilliant red, orange, brown, and greens of many shades tell me I'm home again. The colors you don't see when you're in the fast-paced lanes of the metropolitan cities of our nation. I asked myself many times, how are we going to get the well-deserved protection, preservation, and continued access of this sacred area for the people? It appeared impossible. Then on December 28, 2016, President Obama realized our vision and protected her, establishing 1.3 million acres as Bears Ears National Monument. Though it was smaller than the 1.9 million acres we proposed, we were pleased that the monument proclamation included co-management with the Native leaders. This was such an important moment for the 5 Native nations, such as important, now I'm losing my place. For the 5 Native nations of the coalition, the 26 Pueblos, and the countless tribes and communities who supported us. Bears Ears had been protected for our people, for all people and creatures, and for future generations. But less than a year later, President Obama's successor stripped away monument status from 85% of the land and revoked tribal co-management, dismissing our work for protection and healing. I went to the mountains and I prayed. I sat quietly and sang a song. I needed to soothe my uncertainty and sense of being overwhelmed. As I took in the air and felt Mother Earth beneath me, I knew what I needed to do. First, have faith in those prayers my grandparents laid out on the land. Second, approach the continuing conversation about Bears Ears with the thought that I already have had her protected. I can work from within as though a national monument still exists with the name of Bears Ears National Monument, with a clear understanding that no matter where the roads will lead us, I cannot enter into conversation defeated. Hope, faith, and grace were the tools that my grandmothers bestowed upon me. As the only woman on the coalition, I had to carry the strength and the grace of my grandmothers. Grandmothers whose eyes have witnessed many generations of change to serve our people with hope, gratitude, and love. Resilience is the key, and we shall continue to be graceful, strong, and full of hope, remembering that the power of the world always works in a circle. The female voice is the heart of the family and story and plays. Today I bring my story to those pages and a growing circle of leaders, families, hunters, writers, singers, and dancers connecting to our mother. The sun will rise in the east and set in the west. Some things will never change, but what can be changed is self and purpose. And I put my best foot forward to protect and promote peace, love, and harmony for Mother Earth, my neighbors, and all people of this land. Join with others. Our voices rise in prayer, in song. Our stories, old and new, carry on the wind through the pines into the streets and schools and churches, into the voting booths and the halls of justice. Everything now comes full circle.
Anybody have any questions or comments?
Good work.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just would like to ask you, Regina, if you would talk a little bit more about White Mesa Mill. Who owns that mill?
The White Mesa Mill is located right south of Blanding and right north of the White Mesa community, which is a part of the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And the White Mesa Mill is a uranium processing mill, the only one in the country that is doing this. And they're owned by Energy Fuels, who is a company out of Canada, who also owns a lot of the uranium mines and possibly future mines and those mines that may be reopening from the Grand Canyon, the rims of the Grand Canyon, and within the footprint of the Obama designation. There are mines that are being looked at being utilized again or established. And these are threatening the water supply, the underground aquifer, which is coming awfully close. I know that when I had started working on that specific issue, we were very close, and that was like about 5 years ago. I haven't specifically checked to see if they have actually reached contamination, but I have no doubt that if it hasn't, then they're even closer than they were 5 years ago.
So just to follow up, is anybody doing hydrology study to track the bloom, whatever's happening?
They have partnered with several groups, and I know that one big group who has helped set up litigation and do a lot of the hydrology testing and studies has been Grand Canyon Trust. There's been several other groups that have joined in with them. I know the Ute Mountain Ute tribe still works a lot with these groups as well.
But other than that, there's no federal agency.
Well, you
tribe
know,
itself.
the interesting part of that conversation is how Utah leaders have managed to lobby some of these agencies, and the policies and the regulations seem to always fluctuate in formulas, what applies, where is that standard that they just barely fly under the radar. So it's just been this really strange conversation that suits the industry as needed. And that's been the biggest challenge, especially to me. Quality of water, to me, is not a choice, especially when the ranchers realize that where are their livestock going to get the water from? And in the Southwest, especially in that part of Utah, water is very, very valuable because we don't have enough. So when we begin to think about the outcome at the end of the day, I think at some point we won't have an opposition with the locals in terms of ranchers and farmers, because the common thing is use of water, quality water.
Well, and air too.
Right.
Air, yeah. That stuff's not even covered. It's blowing, those prevailing southwest winds, it's blowing right into Colorado.
Nobody has air monitors to Utah, to anybody.
There are a few air monitors. I know my tribe has set up one monitoring station just on the outskirts of the community there. And we all know that there has been air studies done, and we know that there is a huge airstream that literally is unstoppable but very obvious. So how they're collecting and capturing that data, I don't think they're doing a very good job. And I highly doubt Utah's going to pour money into capturing that data.
And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doesn't care that it's just blowing loose. Like, all that stuff should be covered.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I don't want to keep you too long. I know we've been here a long time, so you had your hand up.
So over the next week, the new Polis transition team is having talking and listening sessions. And if people are interested in putting comments out there, I'm on the transition team, and I'm actually going through resumes for the Department of Natural Resources and Division of Wildlife and Department of Energy and the Commissioner of Agriculture.
Wow.
So if you have comments that you want to put into the transition team, that's the way to do it. The governor will be making the choices on who's going to sit in those positions on December 8th. So your comments are very apropos right now about what kind of person you would like in that position.
And you bring up a very, very important point. And that's something that I really, really want to encourage people. Be present, be a part of the procedures, and just don't be afraid and be fearless about sharing what's within your heart. Your comments don't need to be so intelligent in a way that anybody needs to decipher it. The comments that they really look for are the ones that are heartfelt.
Yes.
And if you share a story specifically,
Yes.
those are the comments that will be generally pulled out.
It's true.
But I also want to encourage you all that if you really, really feel compelled to write an op-ed, write to your letters to the editor, because these are also places where our nation's leaders look to see what the pulse of the communities are. They spend time just combing newspapers to see what is happening out in rural America.
So the transition team website is boldlyforward.co. There's a place to share your thoughts. The team is being chosen right now, so in the next week, if you get your comments in, they are reading the comments and responding to every single one. So
Awesome.
say
Thank you.
something.
Thank you.
I think we should, come talk to us. We've kept a lot of you a long time. I'd still love to hear from you, but we have books to sign, and you can talk to us then or after. But I just want to give people a chance to move on out. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.